we're going to start by talking about the history of Reiki. So in this video, I'm going to go over how Reiki started and how it traveled to the point where you are now reading and listening to this recording and receiving this information. So energy healing has been used for most likely as long as humans have been walking on the earth. When somebody is hurt, they put their hands there. If I have a headache, I'm going to put my hands on my head and go like, oh, and hopefully help it to relieve. When my daughter falls down, for example, and hurts her knee, she puts her hands to exactly what is hurting. So this energy is actually your birthright. It is everybody's birthright, and it is around and available to everybody. With that being said, there's this Reiki with a capital R was cultivated by a man named Dr. Mikao Yasui in Japan in the last century. And we credit him with being the founder of Reiki because he's the founder of this particular language of talking about this energy healing. However, energy healing has been used across cultures, across boards, all over the place. This is just one specific way of talking about it. Dr. Mikao Yasui was born in 1865, and we don't actually know a whole lot about his life, but we do know that he studied a Japanese form of Qigong called Kiko, and we presume that perhaps this seeded in him an idea of how one could use energy to heal without needing to do exercises and build them up first in the body. So he was a Buddhist monk, and he was actually quite a successful businessman. And at one point, he was the secretary to Shinpei Goto, who later became the mayor of Tokyo. However, in 1914, his business failed, and he let all of that go, and he began to travel around in a more free kind of way, searching for ways to heal people. And this wanderings led him to Mount Kurama in Japan, which is a mountain where there's an artificial waterfall that's still there that comes down. And we don't actually know much about what happened when he was sitting on that mountain. But the legend goes that he sat there for 21 days and he gathered 21 stones and he put them in front of him. And every day he would sit and meditate, pray, and throw one of the stones off the mountain as the sun set. And he sat for 21 days, so the story goes, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. And at the 21st day, he took the very last stone, threw it off the mountain, and then all of this Reiki symbols entered into his body. And that is what we call the first Reiki attunement that he received from the universe. He then traveled on off the mountain and began to heal people using this energy that he had found, that where he didn't need to store up the energy in order to practice. So in 1922, he formed a healing society in Tokyo. And then in 1923, there was the Great Kanto earthquake, in which 140,000 people died. So this was a really massive disaster. And he opened up a clinic there and began to heal people in the street and everywhere using this Reiki healing, which is quite phenomenal actually for trauma. So it seeds in me the curiosity of if the Reiki also went along with working people with trauma, if that wasn't somehow birthed by the environment where it developed. In 1925, he opened up a much larger clinic in Nakano, Tokyo. And then he began traveling around and teaching Reiki, and he trained 16 Reiki masters to be able to, people that could then pass on Reiki to other people. And in 1926, he was actually teaching a Reiki class, and he had a stroke and died in that moment. And somehow the idea that he died teaching Reiki really moves me, in that his dedication and his commitment to this path of healing. So then what happened was there was a woman named Hawaii Takada. Our story takes us to Hawaii. And there she was working on the sugarcane plantations. And there was a moment when her sister died and I think her husband died. And she ended up quite sick and having a nervous breakdown. And her parents, who still lived in Japan, invited her to come visit them. And she came there and she began to receive 2 Reiki sessions a day at the clinic there. And at that time, Dr. Hayashi, who was the successor to Dr. Yasui, was holding the clinic, and she began to receive these sessions twice a day for 3 months. And at the end of that 3-month period, not only was she healed, but she had had a spiritual transformation in her life. So she eventually, after some years of study, became a Reiki master herself, and she went back to Hawaii and began to open up a couple of clinics there and began to teach Reiki as well as practicing it. So Takata was operating in an environment of quite extreme anti-Japanese sentiment, and she changed a lot of what was happening in the Japanese lineage into a way that was more digestible for the Western world. And what that looked like actually was taking Reiki out of the context of Buddhism, Japanese Buddhism, and putting it into the context of Christianity. So she told a story where Dr. Mikao Yusei was a Christian who was looking for a way to heal, how Jesus was healing, and her transformation of the story made it so that this energy and this healing method could really spread in this environment. She systematized Reiki and made it into 12 hand positions and made these special rules about Reiki that you couldn't write anything down and certain amounts to charge for Reiki. And she kind of formatted it and codified it into a set system. And then she began to train Reiki masters, and one of her Reiki masters began teaching Reiki for a cheaper amount. And then it really spread like wildfire throughout the globe. So that's how I found Reiki. I was in India, actually, living in Rishikesh or traveling around. I'd been in silence for a better part of 6 months by the time I came across it. I'd been in India for over a year. And I was on the banks of the Ganga, and my friend Ram said to me, "Oh, I'm going to Rishikesh to learn Reiki." And I said, "Well, what's Reiki?" And he said, "I have no idea, but there's some kind of Reiki workshop happening. Why don't you come with?" And I said, "Okay." So I jumped in the rickshaw, even though I had no idea where I was going or why. And we went on the journey to Rishikesh, and there I met this woman who was teaching a Reiki workshop, and I don't even remember her name. And I remember in the workshop we learned the different hand positions, and I looked at all the people that were learning all the Reiki, and they were all very excited about it. And my experience during this time was that I didn't understand what anybody was talking about. I didn't grow up in California. I didn't have a sense of what energy is. It wasn't something that was part of my repertoire. Even though I was quite deep into yogic practices, I didn't know about Reiki or this type of energy healing. And so I had a little bit of disappointment at the end of the workshop as I looked around and everyone was getting it and feeling kind of left out and like the person that didn't understand what was happening. And at the end of the workshop, we were all holding hands, and I looked around and I thought to myself, and I remember this really distinctly, well, I don't know what is this Reiki thing, but I am in love with everybody in this room. And so, years later, I realized that was Reiki. It was just that I was trying to look for what my head was thinking was Reiki rather than what my heart was thinking was Reiki. That was my experience when I first studied it. And then I was living on the banks of the Ganga at the time in a tent and with some other seekers who were equally as passionate as I was about all the things to do with consciousness and evolution. And we would practice Reiki in the mornings or whenever, and I didn't really feel like I had a lot of control over when it would come or not come. But I remember walking around and saying, "Oh, I have Reiki suddenly coming out of my hands. Anybody want Reiki?" And then I would go and like the Reiki would work, and then it would mysteriously not work. And I didn't really know why or how, or it just was kind of this attuning of myself to feeling this energy in my system. Well, a few months later, I was in Manali walking again. I was in a walking way with my little fanny pack and looking for a place to sleep. And I met this man who suggested I could sleep in his little cabana up on the top of the mountain. And so I walked up the mountain, and when I got there, I met this man named Dan. And I said, "Hi, my name was Ganga at the time. And I said, "I'm looking for a place to to rest, and he said, "Oh yeah, come over here. This is probably where you're looking for. I'm off to get my Reiki master attunement," he told me. And I was like, "Oh, I know what Reiki is, kind of, or whatever. I just studied this Reiki." And he said, yeah, I'm going to go get my Reiki master attunement. And he was so jazzed about the whole thing. And he went off and he came back, and we just began to sleep, eat, dream Reiki. Like everything was about Reiki, and we would do the symbols. We were just completely kind of all about the Reiki. And he trained me in Reiki too. And I began to travel around with him and teach Reiki with him. And eventually he trained me in Reiki master. And at some point, after some time of traveling and teaching in Ladakh and the Himalayas, we ended up in Glastonbury, England, where I opened up a Reiki school there and began teaching. And then later my adventures brought me to California, where I began teaching Reiki. So that's sort of how I ended up coming on this path. And Reiki really instilled in me an intense curiosity for consciousness, for the body, for spiritual unfoldment, and for the question of how do our bodies impact our consciousness. And this took me on many other healing paths. There was a Rosen method, and eventually studying nutrition, and Chinetsang, and Shiatsu, and Tuina, and then acupuncture, and just really sent a quest for me. I was also going to tell the story of after my Reiki master attunement, I was walking back from the mountains, and I just started getting really foul things coming out of me from every end. But when I got back to the cabana where we were staying, there was this crystal grid of these crystals laid out, and I put my hands over them, and I felt the energy of the crystals for the first time. So it really did increase my ability to tune into subtle energy fields and attune myself to the living energy in all things, whether that's crystals or the earth or the plants or bodies or myself. And so I feel really excited about this opportunity to pass on what I've cultivated over the last 20 years of practice with people and plants and animals and manifestations. So we'll dive in. So just to recoup what we just did, we just talked about the history of Reiki. We went through Dr. Mikao Yasui, his journey in teaching Dr. Hayashi, who then taught Hawaya Takata, who then taught a bunch of Reiki masters, who eventually taught Dan Burge, who taught me.